This is Dateline News and Conversation. You know, here in Russia, the Charlie Kirk assassination is hardly mentioned. Yet, in the news reports that I'm getting, there are massive demonstrations in London and Paris and other places around the world that are memorializing him. It's obvious that he had a tremendous effect on a lot of people. I wasn't going to get into Charlie Kirk on this show, but after reading an article penned by our good friend Sylvia Demarest, who's the guest on the show tonight, I felt we had to look into it. The title of her article on her Substack channel, Populist Talk, Populist Message, read this: Who really killed Charlie Kirk? The internet says Zionist interests are responsible. Is this possible? We'll look into this and other happenings in the United States and around the world with Sylvia Demarest. Sylvia, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Regis. How you doing?
Doing great. Always wonderful to have you on the show. Sylvia, I'm just going to turn it over to you. What motivated you to write this article? And then let's delve into it.
Well, I didn't really know very much about Charlie Kirk until my Gen Z niece kept texting me about him. And so I decided to look into it. And when I did, I realized what an impact he had had on so many young people, not only in the United States, but around the world. And, this new generation, which we call Gen Z and Gen Alpha, uh, they're going to be a different generation from a lot of previous generations. For one, they're confronted with an awful lack of economic opportunity. And I think it's beginning to have an impact on their thinking. But if you'll let me just for a moment discuss Charlie Kirk and what I've discovered. He was discovered as an 18-year-old young man. He was in college. He was encouraged to drop out of college and to start this Turning Points USA organization. He was a young evangelical, and they're very Zionist. They have been programmed really by this Scofield Bible, which I don't know very much about, and by the fact that a lot of the preachers in these evangelical churches have a lot of support from Zionist interests. And so Charlie Kirk was a pretty typical young Zionist, and I think very useful to Zionist interests because he's a remarkable young man. So anyway, for many, many years, he was funded by Zionist interests and pretty much complied with Zionist interests. But then his age group that he appealed to began to change. In the conservative movement, only 24% of young people still identify with Israel. And in the liberal side of the equation, it's even less than that. So, if you're a leader of an organization and your young people are telling you you're on the wrong track, I think eventually that begins to force you to take a look at issues and to modify your point of view. And there's a lot of evidence that having achieved the age of 31 years old and being married and having two little kids, that Charlie Kirk was beginning to change. And I think what's important here to remember is that I have no evidence that he was killed by Zionist interests. What I did in the Substack is I took what was being said on the internet and said, is this possible? And looked into the history of Zionism and how they have used murder and assassination in the past to point, and their profile on the internet, where they're very, very dominant, and they go in and they start movements, and then they co-opt these movements to achieve their objectives. And so, I asked in my essay which narrative that Charlie Kirk violated will be blamed for his assassination. And I think we know the answer now. It's going to be the transgender movement and the left-wing movement. We're beginning to see evidence of movement in that direction. And I think that's being done um, as a convenience to the current power structure.
Yeah. I want to dig down a little bit deeper on the change of mind that Charlie Kirk seemed to undergo. And you and others have been documenting with facts uh, at how Charlie Kirk began to shy away from the Israeli narrative uh, vis-a-vis Palestine, that Israel had the right to self-defense. He began to see what was happening in Gaza, as you mentioned, probably very much influenced by his millions of supporters who, as you mentioned, have turned away in huge numbers. The other thing, and I want you to comment on, is that um, I had no idea who this guy was. I didn't know that he had befriended Donald Trump or Trump had befriended him. He was a guest in the White House. Supposedly, he influenced Donald Trump to pick J.D. Vance as his vice president. But as he had more and more contact with Trump in the White House, he began to see the influence of Zionists over Donald Trump in the White House. You and I have done several shows about the Zionist influence on the American political elite. I want you to pick it up from there, Sylvia. We'll continue with the effect that it's had on left and right and Gen Z, but for now, I want to follow up on how Charlie Kirk's beliefs began to change and probably really threatened Bibi Netanyahu, Israel, and the Zionist people who supported him in the United States.
There's a lot to unpack there. I think I want to let Charlie's words speak for himself. And I think the first impact that really influenced him was October the 7th, 2023. And if you'll allow me to do that, I want to read exactly what Charlie Kirk said about October the 7th, because I think it's very important. Uh, he said, I've been to Israel many times. The whole country is a fortress. When I first heard the story, I still had the same gut instinct I did initially. I find this very hard to believe. I've been to that Gaza border. You can't go 10 feet without running into a 19-year-old with an AR-16 or an automatic machine gun that's an IDF soldier. Right. The whole country is surveilled. So let me get right through this. We don't talk about Israeli politics very often, and most Americans don't know this. In the last 9 months, and this is the 9 months before October 7th, 2023, Israel was on the brink of civil war. It's not an exaggeration. This judicial stuff, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis taking to the street because Benjamin Netanyahu was basically redefining the Israeli constitution. That's not an exaggeration, right? He said the judicial branch had too much power. There were protests planned this week against Netanyahu that were anticipated that tens of thousands of people would take to the streets. That's all gone. This is Charlie Kirk. That's all gone. Netanyahu now has emergency government and a mandate to lead. I'm not willing to go so far as to say that Netanyahu knew there was intelligence, but I think questions need to be asked. Was there a stand down order on October the 7th? Was there a stand down order that went on for 6 hours? I don't believe it. Israel is the size of New Jersey. When I took a helicopter ride from Jerusalem to Gaza, to the Gaza border, it's 45 minutes. Yet this went on for 6 hours. They were live streaming the killings of Jews. was someone in government saying, stand down? That is a legitimate non-conspiracy question. The whole country is IDF, the whole country. And they were going to concerts, to kibbutz, by reports, and it took 6 hours to respond. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it is. And there's more. And I'm sure you have a detail there. Not only did he begin to see and discover that Israel was committing atrocities, even genocide, and beginning to question the October 7th narrative about a stand down. Many people have questioned that. He's not the only one. Lots
But
and
to
lots
have
of people.
Charlie Kirk questioning it, particularly when they have invested tens of millions of dollars in building his organization, I think that immediately began to create questions in the minds of some people. And in fact, one guy said not too long after that, uh, Turning Points USA has an anti-Semitic problem, and if Charlie Kirk continues to be head of Turning Points USA, it will be identified as an anti-Semitic organization. Now, to continue with this, Charlie Kirk made an appointment with Donald Trump back before the Iran Israel war, the 12-day war. And he warned Trump not to allow Israel to talk the United States into going into war with Iran. That was something that Donald Trump apparently did not appreciate. The second thing I understand is that Bibi Netanyahu offered a flood of money to Kirk to fund his organization, and he turned him down. And then just before he was assassinated, this is what he said. I mean, just hours before his assassination. He said, Jewish donors have a lot of explaining to do. They have a lot of decoupling to do because Jewish donors have been the number one funders of radical, open border, neoliberal, quasi Marxist policies, cultural institutions, and nonprofits. It's a beast created by secular Jews, and now it's coming for Jews, and they are like, what on earth happened? And it's not just colleges, it's the nonprofits, the movies, Hollywood. If the country doesn't wake up and say no more, and then he closed by saying, "And I don't care if you hate me." A few hours later, he was dead.
Yeah, and he also confided to friends that I'm sure you know and are aware of that he was fearing for his life, that he would be killed, and he began wearing a bulletproof vest. And one of the videos that I saw of the actual assassination was that the bullet hit him about where I guess his heart was, ricocheted off this vest and hit him in the throat and killed him. Uh,
I've looked at those videos. I'm not sure about that, but I think, all right, number one, I had been under the impression that the guy that they captured had confessed. He is not cooperating with the police. Okay. He is not cooperating with the police. And I want to make this very clear to everyone because this is a very important point. They did find a gun and there was a bullet that had been fired in that gun. Okay. But we don't know when that bullet was fired unless and until they produce the actual bullet that killed Charlie Kirk and through forensic evidence absolutely document that it was fired by that gun. We don't have any evidence here. Okay. It has to be documented. And I read somewhere, and I've been trying to pin this down, and I haven't been able to. I read somewhere that they have not recovered that bullet. I'm sorry, but that's a bunch of BS. Number one thing you do in a murder is you preserve the evidence. That bullet needs to be recovered, and they need to demonstrate to the public that they could tie that bullet to the death of Charlie Kirk and to the gun that they discovered. If they don't do that, then we do not know who fired the bullet that killed Charlie Kirk.
well, and that's coming from a lifelong and now retired trial lawyer, not some ordinary bloke on the street like me who doesn't have any experience with this kind of forensic evidence in trials.
Oh,
And
I
so,
could go on about the other issues here, but suffice it to say, this is a fundamental issue. You have got to tie the weapon that you found with the actual murder. And the way to do that is to take that bullet and forensically to determine that it was in fact fired from that gun. Otherwise, you have an empty cartridge, but you have no evidence that it was the murder weapon.
Yeah, and there's a lot more, obviously, that has been reported about the holes in the whole narrative. Um, and this Tyler Robinson and this story about, that his roommate and lover was a boy who was transitioning to transgender, to a female. When I heard all of this, Sylvia, the first and so much of the narrative just appeared almost instantaneously, including Donald Trump coming before the country, demanding that all flags be flown at half mast, and giving Charlie Kirk posthumously the Medal of Freedom, a very high award in the United States. The first thing I thought of, Sylvia, is haven't we seen this play before? The
You know,
first thing.
as I said in my first essay, Charlie Kirk questioned whether or not you could actually change your sex. Okay. So that was a narrative violation because the narrative that's been created around transgenderism is that you can change your sex. And Charlie Kirk said, no, you can't change your sex. So that was a narrative violation. And I said, which of the narratives that Charlie Kirk violated will be blamed for his murder? And so then you have to ask the question. Transgenderism has been around forever. And, I have a lot of sympathy for people that are going through those kinds of issues and those kinds of transitions. I don't think they need to be demonized. I think they need to be understood. I think they need to have compassion and understanding. I have no problem with these kids whatsoever. As many people, however, and including Charlie Kirk, thought that it would be wrong to apply drugs and surgical techniques to children who do not have the capacity to consent and to make that decision for themselves as an adult. This has been a huge controversy in this country. And what I noticed was, and I kind of noticed this right after the Oberdorf opinion. The Oberdorf opinion was the opinion that held that gay marriage was legalized, and it was kind of the last big battle that the gay movement fought. And so the gay movement won. And so then you have to ask, what is there left for that movement to do? It was a politically powerful movement. A lot of gay people have money and make political contributions, etc. And immediately after that, it was like we were flooded with this transgender movement information and increasingly encroaching these trans males who identify as women, encroaching on female space. And that created a lot of controversy, first about this bathroom thing, and then about men and transgender men, women in women's sports, etc. And it was another way, really, to divide the country. Now, we have no idea who was funding this movement. And now that this information has come out in the Charlie Kirk murder, they're now calling it Trans-Tifa because the alleged killer was also associated with going to Antifa protests, as have been some of these other transgender murderers, like the last one in Minneapolis that killed those kids at the Catholic Church. He was also identified with going to these protests, and nobody knows who funds the transgender movement. Nobody knows who funds Antifa. Nobody knows any of this. But the point that I tried to make in my essay is that when you have such an enormous profile and presence on the internet, you can create movements, and then you can surreptitiously, through various means, co-opt that movement in order to encourage people to do things that you want to have done. So you don't have to actually pull the trigger to kill somebody. There are a whole lot of other ways to go about this. And as I also pointed out in my essay, we have been having these young people, especially young men, go off the rails like this and commit all these violent acts. And yet we've shown absolutely no interest in trying to figure out what influences them, why do they do it, etc. And there has to be an influence that's going on here, and there has to be a way to determine what is it that's creating this kind of violent behavior on the part of young men. This particular young man who's accused had been an outstanding student, a 4.0 student, had been seen as kind of a teacher's pet, and was not really someone that you would think would become a murderer. But he's now under arrest. That's the allegation. But I also understand he is not cooperating with the police.
Yeah. Well, as I said before, uh, it reminded me of other patsies, going back to Lee Harvey Oswald, going back to Sirhan, a whole list of other individuals who were accused of assassinations. Uh, I saw the same story here immediately. They were looking to pin this on this kid who you've just described as a model student, not somebody that would be a murderer. But you know what? The country's divided over this already. Whether it was a transgender person or someone influenced by a transgender who assassinated somebody, there's been a number of them in the last several months. And so that narrative is out there dividing the public. Uh,
Well, Regis, these this is a these are mass psychological operations. The murder of JFK out in public, mass psychological operation. The murder of Martin Luther King, vast psychological operation. The murder of Robert F. Kennedy, 9/11, enormous psychological operation, huge impact on the American psyche. And now this, the assassination of a young man out in public who had a program that said "Prove me wrong" in front of his wife and children. I mean, this is an enormous psychological operation that will impact the public, and how it will be used is the question. And I think what we're seeing is that it will be used for repressive purposes. It will be used to repress transgenders, and there's evidence that there have been these transgender groups that have been learning how to shoot. Several of the last mass murderers have been transgender. It's going to be used to clamp down on liberal organizations. It's going to be used to clamp down on the media. And there's now a bill that's been introduced into the Congress that will basically make it a felony to criticize Israel. So this is all being used for repressive purposes, and it's all being used to divide us. And I have no hope that we will ever learn the truth of what happened. But evidently, if Zionist interests were involved, and I'm not saying that there's evidence that they were, but if they were involved, I think it was clear that given the speed with which Charlie Kirk was transitioning into a critic of Israel and into a critic of the hold that they had over the Trump administration, and how they were forcing Trump to do things that were contrary to the best interest of this country. I think they felt like they had a narrow window to accomplish his death. And if you'll notice, Benjamin Netanyahu was the first one to go on television and comment on this death, and to call him a great friend of Israel, and to read from a letter that people are now saying is not what Charlie Kirk said. So there's a lot here, and none of us are ever going to know the truth. But I think it's fair to ask questions, and I think it's fair to say that none of those questions should be considered to be anti-Semitic at all. We have a right to the truth. We have a right to examine the evidence. We have a right to question.
yeah, and you mentioned Trump and his involvement in this. I just read today, and I don't know if it's true, but it's in American media, US media. Trump has just encouraged the Congress to pass a law, and he wants to fund it with several $1 millions to increase protection for government officials, Congress, the Supreme Court, and others to protect them from violence. And Trump is well known for his hostile, violent rhetoric against his enemies, especially the quote unquote left.
But look, let's not go there. Number one, or we can go there, but if we do, we have to admit that the hostile rhetoric is on the other side as well. I mean, those folks on the left have gone around calling everybody fascist. They call Donald Trump a fascist. They call Charlie Kirk a fascist. They call anybody that disagrees with them a Nazi and a fascist. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump who also uses rhetoric very irresponsibly. So we have a political culture here that's not very responsible and not very responsive to the needs of the American people. Now, when the last Turning Point USA conference was held, Charlie Kirk allowed all of these voices to come forward and to give speeches and to question the hold of Zionists on the Trump administration and to question Netanyahu's hold over Donald Trump. And that also created a great deal of dissension. I understand that for several months, Charlie Kirk was under assault from telephone calls and email messages and threats. Basically, they were telling him he did not have the right to deviate from what they wanted him to say, and that he was absolutely required to continue to hold the line in terms of support of Israel. And what he was trying to do was to say, look, you can support Israel, but you don't have to support the current Israeli government. You don't have to support Benjamin Netanyahu, but they weren't having any of that. And so there's no question that he was being deemed a potential issue and problem for Zionism, for Netanyahu, and for Israel, especially concerning the lessening of support for Israel among the American public. And the way things are going, in a few years, you're going to end up with a government that is not going to be in support of Israel because people just will not continue to put up with it. I mean, there's only so much of this you can take.
Yeah. I want to thank you for immediately pointing out that the violent rhetoric has been coming from both sides. Yeah, I know that. And I didn't mean to imply that it was coming just from Trump and conservatives. So now that we've dealt with that, I want to continue on some other things that Charlie Kirk did that raised a lot of eyebrows, not only in the Jewish community, but even with friends of mine who have been MAGA supporters. The whole question of Epstein. He began to question Epstein. Was he an Israeli Mossad spy? What I mean, just when you start opening that Pandora's box, even before the Charlie Kirk assassination, you know that Trump had to be worried because reportedly his name is in the little black book or on a list somewhere. So when I look at this and I see what Charlie Kirk was questioning, I think that some of the reaction that came from Donald Trump and others, some of these headlines that were created were meant to distract from that. Sylvia, do you think any of that is going on now? Attempts by whoever they are to create distractions, or will the country just completely descend into them versus us?
Well, in my first essay, I talked about the fact that Charlie Kirk believed in having discussions on the issues and believed in debating the issues. And I asked the question, are we no longer going to feel comfortable doing that? And then I transitioned to the fact that this is being used to divide us and to keep us from looking at the increasing lack of economic opportunity that these young people are faced with now, and the increasing concentration of wealth and power. I pointed out how, even after the civil rights movement, there continues to be an underclass of unemployed, poverty-stricken Black men and out of wedlock mothers whose children are poorly educated and unable to participate in the economy, and how we don't care about that. I also pointed out that we tolerate a drug culture on the streets that are harming hundreds of thousands of people, and that, we always seem to have money for war. There wasn't any problem with raising $100 billion for the war in Iran, but no money is ever going to be available to deal with any of these issues in the country. And this continued toleration of a Black underclass that has no economic opportunity, whose educational opportunities are very limited, and who are now in their anger, expressing their anger at the continuation of this situation. This is not what the civil rights movement promised. This is not what Black people deserve. And yet they are being used to perpetuate a political party in power. A lot of the Democratic Party in these big cities is based on the fact that they have an enormous amount of support from Black people. So we have economic and political issues in this country, and we are being divided by these issues to keep us from coming together and to realize we have more in common than our differences. A lot of these social issues can be dealt with in other ways. What is important to people are the economic opportunity, it's the concentration of wealth and power, it's the perpetuation of war, it's the spending of trillions of dollars on war. It's the lack of opportunity for these young people. And I think if we could get past these social issues, that we would realize that what we need is a huge populist movement that will reform this system and deal with some of these issues.
Well, let's go to this point, Sylvia. You mentioned at the very beginning of the show Gen Z and Gen Alpha. This is an enormous group of young people of voting age now, probably from the age of 18 to mid 30s, who followed Charlie Kirk, who believed in his message. Obviously, he had millions and millions of followers and millions of dollars supporting his work. Let's talk a little bit now about how this might unfold. I thought at first, and I wondered whether the country was going to erupt into violence. It obviously hasn't.
I certainly hope not. I think that would be, look, there's the people will never be able to express the level of violence that the government will be able to express. I support Martin Luther King's plea for nonviolence 100%. The only way that a populist movement can be derailed is if it turns violent. We need to organize. We need to come together on the issues, and we need to figure out a way to reform this country politically, non-violently. Now, the age group that we're talking about here, some of whom Alpha is not yet able to vote. Gen Z, I think, goes up to maybe 25, 26. The generation after that are the millennials or the X's. I'd have to go back and look. But this generation is increasingly politically active. And we're seeing the evidence of that not only in the United States, but globally. Charlie Kirk probably, in many ways, was responsible for the election of Donald Trump. His organization in Pennsylvania and Michigan, his ability to turn out young people to vote for Donald Trump was probably the deciding factor in the election. He had 5 million subscribers on his X channel alone. This young man, despite the fact that people like you and me had really not paid very much attention to him, had enormous reach. And he was an enormously articulate individual and could express things in ways that I found in many respects to be very, very compelling. I thought he was an outstanding debater, and I'm speaking here as a former college debater myself. Now, What we've seen abroad is, for example, over the last few days, there's been a Gen Z revolution in Nepal. They not only overthrew the government, they burned the parliament. They burned a Hilton hotel that some of the oligarchs there owned. And this was following a visit to that country by Victoria Nuland and Samantha Power. So the first thing I want to point out here is I think we think there's a different foreign policy that applies to Donald Trump, that applies to a Democratic president, but that's not necessarily true. What had been happening in Nepal was they were increasingly aligning with China. If you look at Nepal, it borders China to the north and India to the south. Those are two countries that are very significant and very much in play. But Gen Z had done had overthrown other places, Sri Lanka, for example, Bangladesh. So this is a very active generation. Now, they can be co-opted, and they can be uh, pointed in the wrong direction, and we'll have to see how these revolutions take place. But over time, I think they will begin to understand who their enemies are, and I'm hopeful will unite against the oligarchy, and in doing that, we'll be able to change some of these policies that are creating so much havoc in our country and the world.
Yeah, we're seeing these initially non-violent massive uprisings in London, across the UK, in Paris, across France. They're beginning to happen in Germany. So you can see this political discontent, this hatred of a whole demographic group of people who are turning against those governments. Now, back to the United States and the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. I think what we're seeing, and I started to mention this just a couple of minutes ago, that the country is not turning to violence. These young people, I think, understand that they they want peace. They don't want violence. And I think that they probably are beginning to realize, and it depends on who assumes the leadership, that they are the ones who can change the political structure and change the political discourse. They have followed Charlie Kirk. They do not want violence. They want respect. They want
They
respectful
want
debate.
change. They want economic opportunity, which
And,
has been denied them.
well, I want to come back to that right now because you mentioned that a couple of times. Let's talk a little bit about how the demand for economic equality and opportunity, driven by these young people, driven by millions of Black Americans, might be able to coalesce and and affect a shift in the direction that this country is going.
I go back to the 19th century populists, and I think they had the right idea there. It was a coalition of white farmers and black farmers, along with small businesses and labor, that so frightened the power structure that Southern racists created the Jim Crow movement to destroy the populist movement. So the message there are more of us than there are of them. There is justice in believing that we can have a fair and prosperous economy, which we cannot have under the way the economy is organized today. We need to break up monopolies. We need to deal with concentration of wealth. We need to deal with economic opportunity. We need to provide economic opportunity. One of the suggestions that I made was that we need thousands more small banks that will be able to fund entrepreneurs to be able to start small businesses and participate. That's just one idea. What I hope these young people will do is that they will get together and study history, study the economy, and figure out how to deal with this economic unfairness, this political irresponsibility, and lack of responsiveness. And because they're the future, they're the ones who are going to have to. They're the ones who are going to have to create, initiate, and carry out these reforms. As I've said many, many times, I'm an old lady. I ain't going to be able to do much except talk and write and share my experiences. These young people have the right idea, I think. They understand that their economic opportunities have been diminished and that it's unfair and that it's not an accident. It's a matter of economic policy, and those policies can be changed.
You know, my interest in going forward is not in finding out who or why Charlie Kirk was killed. My interest is in the effect that his assassination is going to have on this country, and especially on these millions of young people who are the future. Uh, our generations have left them with nothing but pain and heartache and economic depravity. So this is my interest, and I really hope that Charlie Kirk's assassination will has a will have a positive effect and a motivating effect on at least large sectors of this country, realizing how we've all been oppressed and how we've not been served by the political elite who have been running this place for a long time.
Two things. I don't know if people saw the statement of his wife. I would urge them to look at that. That would be number one. And number two, there's a pitch battle going on over who will take over Turning Point USA. A rabbi, oddly enough, has offered to do that, and Ben Shapiro has as well. I don't think Ben Shapiro is Charlie Kirk, and I don't think the young people will allow Zionist Jews to take over this organization. So my message to any young person to hearing my words is don't allow that to happen. This is your organization. You find your own leader, okay?
Didn't his wife say that she was going to pick up the microphone?
That's not probably, that's to be determined.
Yeah,
That is the battle of the future.
yeah,
And I want to say the money has come from these from Jewish Zionist Jews. So this is the future battle over Turning Points USA. Who will lead it? What will their message be? And will they continue to try to represent the interest of this young generation, or will they be co-opted by people who do not have the economic and political interests of this generation at heart?